I've been podcasting since 2006. In that time, I've tried countless hosting platforms, but in August 2022, we switched to Transistor to power all of our shows here at True Story FM, and it's been a game changer.
I love the Transistor allows unlimited podcasts and storage without extra charges. We can publish so much content, and we do. If you want to start up a podcast, do yourself a favor and host your show on Transistor.
With their one-click publishing, you can get your new show onto all the major podcast directories effortlessly.
And their website builder lets you quickly build custom sites for each show.
The detailed analytics are invaluable too. You can access all kinds of listener data anytime.
Oh, and the versatile players allow you to embed episodes anywhere to reach new listeners. Plus, the team behind Transistor is super responsive and keeps making the platform even better.
After using countless hosting services over 15 plus years, Transistor has been, hands down, the best podcast partner for us.
If you want a hosting platform to take all the worry out of getting your podcast out into the world, go to thenextreel.com/transistor and check it out.
Support our show and support your own show by going to thenextreel.com/transistor. Start growing your podcast today.
Welcome to CinemaScope, where we animate the conversation around the vibrant, action-packed realms of cinema's genre landscapes. I'm Andy Nelson, your guide on this quest to bridge the film genres, subgenres, and movements. Today, we're diving into the captivating world of anime, a medium that has become so influential and distinct that it warrants its own place in the conversation. While not a genre or movement in the strictest sense, anime has carved out a unique identity with its diverse storytelling, stunning visuals, and ability to captivate audiences worldwide. From the early days of Japan's first color animated feature to the groundbreaking works that have redefined the art form, we'll explore the key elements that make anime stand out. Join us as we uncover the origins, evolutions, and global impact of this beloved medium. Now, before I introduce my guests, I just want to talk about membership quickly. CinemaScope is a part of the Next Reel family of film podcasts, and that family of shows is supported through membership from people like you. Members get early access to ad-free episodes, not to mention extended episodes. In fact, on this show, you normally only hear us discussing 5 films, but members get to hear us discussing 5 additional films to enrich their understanding of the genre. For this special episode, however, I'm releasing the conversation about all 10 films to everyone. That's right, you're getting a little taste of what it's like being a member. So see what you think, and if you're interested, head to truestory.fm/join to learn more about becoming a member. It's just $5 a month or $55 a year. Now, joining me for this conversation, I have 2 wonderful guests that I'm so excited to have here to talk about anime. So when I introduce you, tell us a little bit about yourself, how you discovered anime, and what made you fall in love with it. Let's start with Andrea Horbinski. Hey, Andrea.
Hey, how's it going?
Fantastic. Thanks for being here.
Thanks. I'm excited. I'm an independent scholar. I work actually mostly on the history of manga, and my book on the history of manga is hopefully coming out from University of California Press next year, called Manga's Global Century. But anime came from manga, so I do discuss anime in the book and its origins and the way it continued to relate to manga since it emerged in the 60s. As for how I got into anime, I was in high school and I watched Outlaw Star on Toonami and a show called Revolutionary Girl Utena in my high school anime club. Utena had girls with swords, and both of them had serial stories as opposed to American cartoons, which just, had sort of endless iterations of the characters doing one-off plots. I was very into both of these things, and I started watching anime, got really into it, decided I would go to a college where I could study Japanese and learn a living language. At that point, I'd really only mostly studied Latin and ancient Greek. And through various pathways, the rest is history. And here I am.
And here you are. Fantastic. Well, we're thrilled to have you being a part of this discussion. And Rayna Denison, hello.
Hi, great to be here. Thank you for having me on.
Absolutely.
To answer your questions, very similar to Andrea, I grew up in the States originally, and so I grew up watching anime without knowing that's what I was doing. So things like G-Force or Battle of the Planets were on my weekly Saturday morning cartoons. And so, I grew up kind of steeped in anime without knowing that's what it was. Then My family moved back to the UK and I grew up here, and a friend introduced me to this really weird cartoon he'd found called Akira. And so from there, the rest is kind of history for me. I went down and found as much anime as I could find, and I've been studying Japanese as a consequence of that, and really studying anime ever since.
Oh, that is fantastic. For me, very similar. Like growing up, I was watching these things like Voltron,
Oh, yeah.
Robotech. And then when I was in high school, the college near where I lived had a film program like many do, and they played a film called Lensman.
Oh.
Which we went and saw. And I just totally fell in love with that. And it was just such a fun film to watch. And I think in the scope of anime films, it's not necessarily like one of the upper echelon, but still as a kid, as a young person, it just was something that felt a little different than all the Disney stuff I'd be seeing. And I'm certainly a fan of the Disney animation too, but it was something new. And I think that's what I really enjoyed about it. So let's jump into this discussion, because I guess the first question for both of you is, what is anime? Is it just simply Japanese animation, or is there actually something more to it?
Oh, boy.
Would you like to try and tackle that one, Andrea? It's a big question.
It's a big question.
Yeah.
I think in some ways it has either a very simple answer or an endless series of complicated answers. I think the easiest way to define it is animation that's made in Japan. But what made in Japan means is actually really complicated. Anime has been outsourcing aspects of production to various other countries since the 60s, not long after TV anime started with Astro Boy. Just as American animation also outsources labor to other cheaper countries. In fact, Rank and Base, a lot of their animation work with the puppets was outsourced to Japan in the 50s. Other labor for other animated shows was also outsourced to Japan in those years. Now it's more likely to be Taiwan or Vietnam. So animation in general is sort of hard to pin down. But I think in terms of made in Japan, I tend to define it as like the creative staff being in Japan, creative control being in Japan to a greater or lesser extent, which I think, for my taste, cuts out movies like The Last Unicorn, which, was mostly made in Japan. But again, creative control was in the States. A lot of times when people mean anime, especially outside of Japan, they tend to talk about movies and TV as being the same category. I think a lot of times, actually, they're quite different, but of course, there's a lot of crossover. What has made anime is the emergence of TV anime in '63 with Astro Boy, or Tetsuwan Atamu. Because Tezuka and his employees at studio Tezuka Productions, they had so little money, and Tezuka made some choices that made them get less money than they needed to get it on air. They wound up employing a whole hodgepodge of labor-saving and animation-saving techniques, which I think really established the look of anime, a lot of its sort of distinctive stylistic aspects. The show was a huge hit and immediately launched several copycats, and then that evolved into the genre we know now. Those stylistic sort of quirks and practices became elements of the genre. And manga, eiga, cartoon films, animated films were influenced by that, and people started crossing between them, as some of the directors who the films we're talking about today did. So yeah, I think you have to look at TV, and you have to look at where creative control is.
My first book, Anime, A Critical Introduction, was all about what is anime and what are its genres. So I think I came to very similar conclusions to Andrea's, but there are histories and lineages that come into this that are worth mentioning as well. So Toei Doga, or Toei Animation, that Andrea was just kind of referring back to, is the home in Japan in the 50s and 60s of the manga eiga. And it's what trains Hayao Miyazaki and Isao Takahata and other famous animators, who then leave that studio and go off into the TV industry as it's blossoming in terms of cartoon or anime in the 1970s and 80s. So we get a kind of, I suppose, industrial starting point for a lot of anime in Toei Animation that then kind of spreads really quickly. And even someone like Tezuka worked with Toei briefly before starting his own company, Mushi Pro. So there's lots of connections back to Toei, and their aim was to make animation in the style of Disney full animation. But then as time went on and the budgets got tighter, they started finding workarounds. And the same as with Tezuka and Mushipro needing to make animation cheaply and finding those cost cutting and cost saving measures that would allow the impression of movement without full animation movement. There's a similar thing happening there. And what I love now is that that's become anime's aesthetic. It's an aesthetic of choice now. So as much as most animation in Japan is now made on computers and you can put the camera anywhere in a scene and have it gliding around, Kimetsu no Yaiba's fight scenes are a great example of that. At the same time as there's that, you will also still, like in early sequences of Attack on Titan, get moments of stillness and what are called tomoe or still shots, which are hallmarks of the anime style. So there's something that goes from necessity into aesthetics over the course of 60, 70 years of animation in Japan, which I absolutely love. But I think Andrea's right as well. Anime in Japan is not the only kind of animation. There's stop motion puppetry. There is a vast tradition of independent and artistic animation being made in Japan as well. The kind of joy of anime is it's one aspect of Japanese animation, but it's the dominant one. And it's one that has then, from that starting point with Tetsuo Anatomu in the 1960s, has kind of blossomed into a whole range of genres, styles, market segments that it's trying to feed into as well.
I'm glad you both kind of mentioned the TV aspect, because I don't think it's a complete conversation about anime without really talking about how much TV is part of all of that. But as a film podcast, we're specifically just talking about the films, but absolutely the TV elements are core to really understanding fully everything going on with anime. In fact, one of the films we're talking about is really like the last 2 episodes of an entire series, right? So there's a lot of flow, ebb and flow going kind of between TV and film in anime.
Yeah. I mean, just to jump in there, absolutely. Yes, there is. You get long-running series of TV anime that are on for decades at a time. So something like One Piece is a great example. And in between the breaks in the television show, you'll often get what's called a gekijoban, or a theatrical version movie. Mm-hmm. So even the TV is making films happen in Japan for anime.
And then I read, like, we're also going to be talking about Macross, Do You Remember Love? And I was reading about that. And one of the later versions of that actually takes that as a movie within the world of the story as something that is a movie that everybody loves watching. And I was like, that's meta at such an interesting level.
Yeah, I love that, because like it tells the story of the Macross series like differently, because obviously it's only 2 hours, but it was so popular and everybody loved it so much. They're like, well, we're just going to keep it canonical somehow. It's the movie version of the TV show in the universe. It's great.
That is so funny. But another point you mentioned is that animation style, how they allowed for those stiller moments to essentially make it more affordable as far as the animation goes, much like I suppose you could say the Disney animation in the 60s when they were using the photocopying technique, finding these ways to do animation more cheaply. But then how that became such an interesting part of anime. And you can see that in a lot of the films. And I think it allows for characters to think and to be pensive and to like pondering the world or whatever. And we have that through a number of these where we're seeing a character just sitting, looking, and just thinking. And as humans, we're watching them as a human or whatever the character might be on screen. And we're thinking about all the emotions they're going through, the thoughts in their heads and everything. But really, as far as the technique goes, it's just a still image that we're staring at for how many seconds. And it's kind of fascinating that they're using it that way. That's definitely a key characteristic of anime. Are there other key points, maybe some storytelling techniques or any other elements about the kind of the art style? Certainly themes, different things that kind of come across a number of different anime?
I think historically, one thing to be aware of is the use of the vocal effects. The vocal effects are one of the ways that, for example, on Astro Boy, Tetsuo Anatomu, they really stretched very limited animation to make it feel more dynamic by getting the voice actors to just sort of do these exaggerated effects. That actually ultimately descends from Kamishibai, which was paper street theater in Japan in the 50s and also in the 30s before the war. A lot of people who were doing it in the 30s had been silent film narrators who were put out of a job by talkies. So when it was revived in the 50s, and was that point, it was mostly returning veterans from the war who were performing for children at street corners with these cardboard paper theaters and sliding images on cardboard to create dramatic effects and doing, again, this vocal performance. That, I think, is a huge influence on anime. At one point, people called Astro Boy electric kamishibai. And that's been a huge thing as well. And anime notably also, with some exceptions, like Akira actually, but with exceptions like that, anime actually mostly post records the vocals. So whereas most American animation has the actors do the voice track first and they animate to the voice track to eliminate lip flap, that costs money. So anime doesn't do it. So the voice actors are usually performing at the end, and they'll have either rough cuts or the finished episodes or movies to perform to.
Huh. Interesting.
So that is a thing I think makes anime distinctive. I would also say, and we'll see this in the movies we talk about too, the emergence of music as like a huge meaning bearing part of the film, not just in the form of like orchestral scores, which you see in The White Serpent or earlier films, but in the 80s, and especially actually with Macross, music really starts to become a huge part of the score. They mix it higher. It takes over the dialogue at several points. And, you know, you see in films like Macross, Ghost in the Shell, Akira, where the music oftentimes is just sort of overwhelming and really is telling you what to feel in these sort of long moments where very little else is happening. And that, I think, is also a huge aspect of anime that makes it pretty unique in a lot of ways.
Yeah, a lot of interesting points there. Rayna, do you have any additional elements that you think are kind of key characteristics?
So I mentioned the Tomie, the still shots that are quite common. Other really common tropes are partial movement patterns. So just moving one part of the body, maybe just the mouth opening and closing in an otherwise still frame. Backgrounds with background characters not moving. So limited movement is a really common phenomenon within anime. You see that less in the films because the films tend to have higher budgets.
Yeah.
So we might not be talking about that quite so much, but it's a dominant trope within anime. The other thing I think that's worth pointing to is the emergence over the last 3 decades or so of house styles for different studios.
Oh, interesting.
Depending on the techniques and technologies being used in studios, they often have very different looking films. So Madhouse, that worked so much with Satoshi Kon, has a very particular look in the kind of 90s, early 2000s. Something like Production IG is the makers of Ghost in the Shell is a really good example. They work quite quickly with computer technologies and really lent into those technologies within the production, which means they have a character look that's quite distinctive, where they have these huge eyes, but they tend to be quite unemotional looking eyes. So they look almost deadened in some ways, rather than having the big glowing stars in them like you get in quite a lot of shoujo anime or girls anime. So there's a really interesting set of styles that come through. Studio Ghibli, obviously, refining and working through the kind of Toei style of animation. But also, if you look at now studios that are run by famous auteurs, so you get people like Makoto Shinkai has a particular style of animation, and he's working with a studio consistently now to produce that style of animation for each of his movies. So we're getting a set of distinctive looks to anime as well. I think the sound point is really good. There's a whole industry of voice acting in Japan that sits alongside anime, where you would train for several years to learn particular kinds of anime voice.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And in that, you will also potentially find singing stars and crossing over to do, those stars are now starting to do live readings. They do, some of them do musical performances alongside working in anime as well. So that balance between kind of trained voice actors in anime is really interesting. And of course, Studio Ghibli, my favorite studio, of course, is, because I've just finished a book called Studio Ghibli and Industrial History. That studio always does the opposite to what everyone else is doing. So they don't work with trained voice actors. They work with normal actors or with children of appropriate ages. And they also do vocal recording in a different way. They have their own voice recording studio. So they work very closely And the compositions with Joe Hisaishi for Studio Ghibli films are really distinctive as well. Studio Ghibli is the gift that keeps on giving because it's always doing something unique within the industry. Each film they make is different to previous ones within anime, I think. So it's an interesting company.
It's a really interesting point too, because like as I've watched, I mean, I've seen a number of films from a number of the directors that we're going to be talking about, but I guess in my head, and maybe this is just, partly coming at it from my perspective over here, like I haven't seen maybe as many, or I don't associate it with the studio. I kind of always associate it with the director, like Satoshi Kon definitely feels like there's a look there. Hayao Miyazaki feels like there's a look there. And I wasn't associating that with the studio, but that's actually a really interesting angle. And I suppose in some capacity, you could almost look at something like the Universal horror films or something and find like there are these ways that a studio could help define what a particular thing was. And that's actually interesting about anime that I hadn't realized before. There's a big part, obviously, all of these coming from Japan, a big element that is a connection to the culture. We see that a lot in, a lot of atomic imagery and kind of that sort of thing. I don't know if that's really kind of a key characteristic, or is that just something that's kind of ended up flowing through a lot of the thinking and some of the themes in these stories, because it's certainly you can see elements of it there. I mean, it's not in everything, but it's in a lot and in different ways than you necessarily would imagine. And it's not necessarily atomic, it's just mass destruction in some capacity, an asteroid hitting the Earth, things like that. Does that kind of fall into realm of being a key characteristic, or is that just something that, having lived through something so devastating and traumatic, that just it's kind of natural to be woven in?
Japan is a place that has suffered a range of disasters, natural and man-made, over the course of its history. And these are typically reflected in and through its film culture, not just in anime, but throughout its film culture. There is the Hibakusha cinema, which is atomic bomb survivor cinema. We see this in Barefoot Gen, the anime, as well as in things like Akira, kind of loosely reflected through that film. So those atomic images are there through a lot of Japanese cinema. Anyone who's watched Takashi Miike's Dead or Alive knows the ending of that film is redolent with those kinds of images as well. I think science fiction in anime carries a lot of that history because it often reflects questions of war. Space Battleship Yamato, for example, and others have these refractions of war and reflections on war, some of which are, like in Summer Wars, about rebuilding a sense of Japanese national unity to defeat common enemies, be they new and AI related or older, and kind of more about the breakdown of Japanese society and culture. But you also see other things reflected. I think the asteroid in Your Name is a good example of that, not least because Makoto Shinkai has talked about how some of his films over the last 10, 15 years, including Suzume, have been about reflecting on the 2011 triple disaster in Japan. So depending on the film, it might be a different iteration or a different variant on a theme.
The atomic bombings were one disaster. And it wasn't just the atomic bombings, but also, the firebombing of almost every major city in Japan, including Tokyo and Osaka and Kobe. That was hugely impactful on everybody who survived one way or another. And a lot of them who were children then did become, creative professionals in manga and then anime as well. Akira actually is an interesting example because the movie tweaks it to be more directly commenting on the atomic bomb. In the manga, the first Akira event was it 87 or 88? It's a different date. But in the movie, it's the same date as the Trinity test, July 16th, which is a deliberate choice. So I would also say too, I think you have to watch the last sort of 12 years of anime at this point as a reflection of 311. It's in Shinkai most obviously, but it's in other people too. I mean, you mentioned Summer Wars. Bell, for example, is kind of a redoing of Summer Wars, but in a cynical post 311 register. I think it's very interesting to compare the response of like the state authorities to the problems in those movies, for example. But yeah, I would say, I mean, And even, a recent Miyazaki film like Kazetachi Nu, The Wind Rises, that has the 1923 Great Kanto earthquake in it, which was the disaster of its day. So it's not like the atomic bombing was the
No,
first
yeah,
time
yeah.
Japan dealt with this kind of thing, unfortunately.
And just for clarity for people listening, when you're referencing 311, what is that specifically?
The 2011 Tohoku earthquake and tsunami and nuclear disaster at Fukushima, which is why I think Rayna mentioned they called it the triple disaster. That was huge, hugely impactful, and still is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think anytime people go through something like that, it's obviously going to be reflected in their art, and I think that's what we see for sure. Let's take a step back before we start talking about these films. We've got a list of 10 films that really kind of we can explore the evolution of anime through them. But before we get into our first film, let's talk about really kind of how we got to this place. What were the influences going on in Japanese society that kind of helped shape the development of anime in those early years, those early stages, leading up to that 1958 film, which was kind of a milestone, being the first color anime feature released?
Multiple starting points, I would say. You had a long history of animation in Japan going back to the very earliest days of animation. So early 1900s, but a set of different filmmakers, three or four of them around 1917, 1918, all rushing to be the first people to make the first theatrically distributed animation in Japan. And from there, animation in Japan kind of moves in drips and drabs. The war is one really big influence on the creation of anime. The need for propagandistic imagery, things like Momotaro there was a series of films featuring him as a character, and they were propaganda films for Japan in the Second World War. So war unfortunately helps. But then off the back of war, we get bigger companies starting to take an interest. So Toei is one of the big film studios in Japan, and they start to absorb other companies and have an animation division. And so that's where we start to see the capacity to make bigger, longer, more technically complex kinds of animation. Then you have the influence of the Chinese animation industry as well. Things like Princess Iron Fan from animated movies from China were becoming quite influential as well. And Disney, of course, is a major influence.
Yeah.
And manga, which is the source. I'm sure Andrew can tell us much more about manga's influence on the animation industry, though.
I think in a lot of ways, sort of the origin point for what we see in the 50s starts in the 30s. Disney cartoons, as well as Felix the Cat. Felix the Cat was a huge hit in Japan until Mickey sort of overtook him in the 30s. People start making what's called manga eiga at the time, so cartoon films, principally popular manga characters like Nora Kuro got animated. So, and Seio Mitsuyo, who actually directed one of the Momotaro films during the war, he directed at least one of the Nora Kuro films in the 30s. So in the 30s and sort of early 40s until kind of the full nationalization of animation, there were these like tiny studios making sort of shorter films. I think the Nora Kuro films are like 1 or 2 reels, so pretty short. After the war, there were a lot of animators and maybe not so many jobs, and labor conditions were also becoming kind of a long-standing issue. Unions at the animation studios went on strike. There are all these conflicts. The strikes led to sort of work stoppages and pauses. So one thing you see in the 50s is actually a lot of people leaving animation for manga and other aspects of publishing because they needed to eat. Seiyuu Mitsuyo wound up illustrating children's books for the rest of his career because he just couldn't take the uncertainty. Other people who were huge in manga, Fukui Eiichi, who died very young but was a contemporary and a rival of Tezuka, he had started as an animator. So that's part of also how you get the evolution of manga into a sort of more animation style, which then by the 60s becomes animated again and re-influences everything. But yeah, and the labor disputes actually continue into the 60s. There's photos of Miyazaki leading his colleagues on strike at Toei in the 60s as a young animator. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind. But yeah, and a lot of those Chinese animations, some of them were actually had Japanese people who'd stayed in China working on them. And some of them were then expelled as the Maoist regime got stronger and then had to come back and keep working in capitalist Japan. Yeah, and again, the influence of Disney is very huge. People watched top secret. Trusted animators were allowed to watch a confiscated print of Fantasia during the war, so you can see it in the Momotaro movies, even though it wasn't officially distributed in Japan until the post-war period. But yeah, a lot people were watching Disney films, and Toei, they really wanted to be the Japanese Disney and do Disney in Japan. So that's the ambition behind something like Hakujaden.
I think I read that they were trying to be the Disney of the East, as they had quoted, which is interesting. Hakujaden, let's jump into this now. This was 1958. Kazuhisa Takenouchi directed. It's interesting. It's got a lot of different English names depending on how the translation. The White Snake Enchantress, Legend of the White Snake, Panda and the Magic Serpent, all sorts of things. It's certainly interesting. It's based on a Chinese tale of the white snake. I found that to be interesting, and reading about it, I guess Japan was working to trying to strike a tone of reconciliation with their neighbor, and chose to tell this story. And I find that to be an interesting element of this. It's a story about a young man. He falls in love with a white snake spirit disguised as a woman, and then they have to navigate challenges from both realms. Their bonds are tested. He has a few pets, a panda and a red panda, who, after she gets taken, they go to try to find her, and it builds to a wonderful climax. This is a film. It had an American dub version and kind of recut version that was released in the States shortly after its Japanese release. And that's the version that's streaming. And that's the version I first watched. And I was like, well, okay, I'm not sure what's going on here. Luckily, I found out that this film had been restored. It's not available, but some people have put it on YouTube. And so then I rewatched the restored version of the original cut, and it was glorious. It was much more interesting and engaging experience. This, but again, the first film here, this film, I mean, it's kind of demonstrating the possibilities for what they could do. Why does this stand out as something like really special in the world of anime?
I was struck by the animation quality. The sequence with the dragon puppet, it's obviously extremely 2D, but it looks like 3D at times. So I think you can see the ways in which the Toei people were really starting to get pretty good. I mean, they'd been good before, but, they were reaching new heights. I'd also say, I think one of the more interesting things about the movie is actually the reaction of people who saw it. For example, Miyazaki saw this. He was about 20 years old at the time, maybe a little older. And afterwards he was like, I was in love with Bai Nyang, like straight up. And so he really has these feelings for this character, which if you read what he wrote, it's like, this is Moe. Miyazaki was inventing Moe, which is ironic because he hates otaku culture, and he wasn't the only person to have sort of this emotional reaction to characters or, sort of non-human objects at the time. But yeah, so I found myself, because of that, focusing on Bai Nyang. And yeah, I thought it was interesting, like how she is sort of becomes like the protagonist by the end. She's the one who's trying to save her lover, who I can't remember his name, Xinxiang or something like that.
Shushan?
Yeah, right. But yeah, she's the one who's fighting the monk at the end. That's interesting. And I think you can also sort of see like the ghost of ideas there that will, again, it might be a little bit of a stretch, but like Miyazaki's heroines are very famously, the protagonists of their films. And I think you can kind of see the roots of that with Bai Nyang here.
Yeah, I would wholeheartedly agree with all of that, for sure. I think there's lots in this movie that would become notable later on as well. So it sets a standard that Toei is then held to for a long time, I think. But it's also a movie that is very much a hybrid of what's going on in all the things we were just talking about. So you get the comedy animal sidekicks, which are very Disney in essence. But you have the kind of the history and legend and tradition that comes from China and is very much a reflection of films like Princess Iron Fan from China. So all the things we were just saying about history are here in this movie. And it's also, famously the starting point for famous animators like Miyazaki, but also I think Rintaro.
Yeah.
The famous anime director had his first job as an in-betweener on this movie. So there's these great sort of industry stories as well as kind of aesthetic stories and mixing going on here. For me, I love the fact that this is also variously translated and has thousands, like it feels like dozens of versions, and some of them are musical and some of them aren't, and some of them have these great sequences in them that they're then cut out in others. I think for me, it's a great movie for us to start with because it shows what happens to animated movies as they travel. And animation is really often suffers from these kinds of issues where as it travels, it's reinterpreted by different cultures in different ways, given new voiceovers, cut, censored, has bits added sometimes. And I think this movie, of all the movies we're talking about today, really does show its own history and its variants and versions. So it's a great place to start just from that perspective. Miyazaki would complain about people cutting down his movie Nausicaa into the Warriors of the Wind, but he has that movie has nothing on what happened to Hakujara as it traveled the world, I think.
No, that American dub that I first watched, I mean, clearly they were targeting American children because they take that sequence of Panda and the red panda later when they're doing the little dance right around the dragon, when they put on the dragon costume. They put that right up front. Like, that's how the film starts with the credits and everything. Very different opening. And then we see it again later. So clearly they were really tapping into, this is a film for kids. We need to make sure these two characters are really prominent throughout. And it really reflects how people thought of animation, you know?
Yeah, but Andrea's right as well. There are elements of what they're doing with the animation in this movie that are just phenomenal for the time. You know, that dragon sequence stood out for me, the puppet dragon sequence.
The battle when she's fighting the monk in the sky. Yeah.
Yeah, no, anytime she's flying, it's beautiful and amazing.
Yeah, it was a really beautiful film. I had never seen it before, and I'm really, really glad to have seen it, but definitely watch the Japanese restored version on YouTube because that's the way to watch it.
Or Daily Motion. I found it on Daily Motion.
Oh, nice. Okay. Good to know.
I loaded up the streaming service and I saw the chop suey font in the credits and I was like, nope, we're out. It's got to be available somewhere else.
Exactly.
Actually, I wonder, I haven't looked into this at all, but I wonder if there was some attempt to obfuscate the fact that it was Japanese in the States at the time and sort of pretend it was Chinese, given the Chinese subject matter.
Interesting.
Possibly because, you know, that might have been better received in the States at that point, given the recent war history.
Right.
I haven't looked into that at all, but that's certainly something I wonder about.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point for sure. We're going to take a jump from 58 all the way up to 1984. We're skipping a lot of history, but we're jumping to Hayao Miyazaki now with Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind. It's considered a Studio Ghibli film, even though it's not a Studio Ghibli film. It's kind of like right on the edge there, but it's often thrown into packages when they're selling it as the films from the studio. This is the story of Princess Nausicaa. It's a post-apocalyptic world. She becomes caught between several warring factions as an ecological disaster looms. She happens to have the ability to kind of communicate with these insects and kind of understand them, these giant insects. And she works to restore balance and kind of prevent global destruction, which we certainly have some visions of here. This is such a fascinating film, and it's definitely introducing some other elements of it. And it's not Miyazaki's first film, but there's kind of a steampunk sensibility with it that is being created here. From where we had started in 58 to here, like, what's the jump in anime that we're seeing happen over the course of time?
Well, interestingly, Andrea mentioned The Last Unicorn a minute ago. This is the same studio that is making this movie. It's Topcraft Studio.
That's funny.
What happened in animation is that TV animation had become a major thing. So it was called terebi manga, TV cartoons, until sort of the mid to late 70s, when a couple of films, Space Battleship Yamato being one of the major ones, really sort of started creating the notion of TV anime as like a distinctive kind of thing, as opposed to an animated offshoot of manga. And anime fans really began identifying as such and sort of creating their own kind of subculture within sort of larger media fandoms in Japan. And Miyazaki had, worked at Toei. He had gone into TV animation. He did a really great show called Sherlock Hound and several others in the 70s, as well as did a Lupin the Third movie, which is a very famous animated and manga franchise, Castle of Cagliostro. That was also hugely influential on manga fan cultures for various reasons. But so yeah, by 84, the Japanese animation industry is much bigger than it was in 58. And there's a lot more studios involved, and there's a lot more money, which I think you could see in Nausicaa for sure. And also, I mean, interestingly enough, it's based on a manga that Miyazaki did. The manga is different than the film wound up being too, in interesting ways.
This movie came about because Miyazaki was drawing and writing the Nausicaa manga for, it was being serialized in a new anime magazine called Animage, which was edited by Toshio Suzuki, who worked for Tokuma Publishing. Tokuma was like the other big publishing conglomerates at the time, like Kadokawa, looking to move into film production as a way of spreading its conglomeration through Japan and creating early forms of what we now call media mix. So it was interested in taking its properties from one medium to another, and Nausicaa, as a proprietary thing they owned, became a really good animation they could adapt. They worked with Topcraft Studio to do this, which is the biggest studio in Japan at the time, the only one they felt could actually cope with an epic story as big as Miyazaki's vision for Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind. It's a really interesting production because it brings together not just the people at Topcraft at the time, but also people that Miyazaki and Takahata had previously worked with in television animation. So they brought in a lot of people to help get this movie finished, who would then, some of them, go with them on to form Studio Ghibli. It's kind of a kind of pre-Studio Ghibli experience for many of them. It's produced by Isao Takahata. So it's not just Miyazaki's movie, but it's also Isao Takahata's film as well. Takahata was very influential in the music side of things for this movie. And okay, so my favorite, I love this movie on so many levels. It's a great adaptation, but it is, Andrea's completely right. It does diverge quite a lot, particularly away from the manga as the movie goes on. The endings of the movie and the manga are quite different and distinct from one another. And that turns out to be a typical Miyazaki adaptation practice. He loves, no matter what he's adapting, he always starts quite faithful and then ends up somewhere different from the book by the end of the production. With Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind, we also see that early element of Miyazaki's environmentalism as a major theme. And here we get...
That's a big one, yeah.
Yeah, that we get that sense of the nuclear holocaust being raged against the power of nature to recuperate Mother Earth. So you get a bit of back and forth between humanity and the natural world in that set of themes and images. It's got the strong central female character in Nausicaa, who is a princess of her people, and then after her father dies, becomes a somewhat messianic figure for her people. But it's a really interesting film because, like the manga, it is full of complex, fully characterized individuals who aren't just, stereotyped or representative of a group. They are really thought through characters with their own arcs in the movie. It's also a movie that has in it some of the tensions that were brewing in anime culture at the time. So in this movie, they brought in animators, including people like Hideaki Anno, who would then go off and form Gainax Studio and make Neon Genesis Evangelion. But in that, we get this tension between the people who had been trained industrially through places like Toei and the rising fan culture that were teaching themselves to animate, that were kind of emerging as animators out of other less traditional means. And that's really fascinating because throughout the 70s and into the 80s, you also get the rise of that otaku culture in Japan and the rise of fandom more generally. Like by the time we get to Nausicaa, there have been massive cultural events around anime, and particularly around anime films with people queuing around city blocks to go watch the Gundam film and having major kind of public events about anime. So the first fan gatherings are happening. The first otaku conventions are happening. So this movie almost comes at the perfect moment to become a hit, because Nausicaa feeds into those kinds of sci-fi fantasy themes, but at the same time, there's a growing fan base for anime more generally. So that really helps it as well. So it's a massive hit when it comes out. And just one final note, Sherlock Hound was such a big hit that when it was out in cinemas, that when they released Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind in cinemas in Japan, it was with an episode of Sherlock Hound. So it was packaged together as a kind of, you like Sherlock Hound, come and see this other film. So it's this really interesting back and forth, again, between TV anime and the film world of anime.
I want G-Kids to license the restored versions of
please,
Sherlock
yes.
Hound for license, at least in the States. But worldwide would be even better, because Sherlock Hound is really great. Yeah, I mean, I would second all that. Animage, of course, was one of the key early anime magazines that was creating and cementing anime fandom. And at this stage, too, it was very much much more insidery and fans talking directly to creators. And they were also the same categories, like with people like Ano Hideaki and others. In the mid 80s, there's a shift with the anime magazines like Animage and New Type, where they become much more sort of studios talk to fans, and that's it. Much more sort of promotional. But at this stage, they were much more creating a dialogue amongst anime fans and creating this idea of anime fandom. So, and I think too, Nausicaa is not as well known as like a otaku heartthrob character as Clarice in Cagliostro, but she definitely has some of the same aesthetics of kind of those characters who appealed to Lolicon fans at the time. So yeah, it's definitely, even though again, Miyazaki has always been very vocally against anime fandom of that kind, and doesn't consider his films anime in that sense. He was part of those developments, and yeah, and I think the fact that it was also Takahata's origin point in a lot of ways is also really important to keep in mind. We didn't watch any of his films, but he made some really great ones, especially if you like crying. So,
Side reference to Grave of the Fireflies, I presume.
Yeah. You take that movie once about every 10 years.
That is a tough one. That is a tough one for sure.
But it's a beautiful movie.
I saw Like a Child at the end of Princess Kaguya as well, which is just gorgeous.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the last fully hand-drawn movie in Japan, probably.
That's a stunning one, absolutely. As far as this one, the kind of the steampunk elements, I've read some like diesel punk elements. Is this the starting point for a lot of that sort of element that we'll end up seeing, even spreading outside of anime, or had it just taken something that had been existing and kind of explored it in different ways?
I mean, the sci-fi genre is doing a variety of these of variants of these kinds of aesthetics. The Miyazaki steampunk thing is interesting, though.
Yeah.
So there's a whole process in this movie called the harmony process. There's one woman who basically comes from Tatsunoko Pro into Ghibli, and she creates this way of animating that is taking surface level cells, cutting out segments, and then articulating them like puppets. And so they're painted with background paints. So they're made to articulate and move. So the distinctive movement of the Om that kind of goes back and forth, this is her invention for this company. And so she's the reason there's a lot more detail in some of the foregrounds characters, because they have those, they're not having to like repaint the image over and over again. They can just articulate the puppets so it can be more detailed and varied. The digitized version of this is what they're using to make Howl's Moving Castle move later on in Studio Ghibli.
Well, and it speaks to the point we had earlier about kind of finding cost-cutting ways to do it. You're not having to redraw it every time. You're just moving the pieces around. It's definitely noticeable in the Ohms as you're watching them kind of move, because, I mean, it gives them that shell aspect. The shell itself doesn't move, but each shell moves next to the other shells.
It makes them feel very organic.
Yeah, absolutely.
Her name is Naoko Takaya. Sorry. It took me a while to track that down, but there's a couple of YouTube videos with one of the ex-members of Gainax talking about it that you can still see online.
Gotcha. Well, we go from Nausicaa, which kind of, we're seeing some of Miyazaki and his environmental themes. We're seeing kind of the steampunk origins, some of these other techniques that they're doing. And now we're going to move into Macross, Do You Remember Love, 1984, by Shoji Kawamori and Noboru Ishiguro. we wanted to make sure we had a film that kind of dealt with the mecha and these ships. We talked about Space Battleship Yamato as a possibility, but opted for this one because it also includes the musical element, which I think is such an interesting addition to this. And as something, we've already mentioned this came from a series that they then said, well, let's retell the story, but compress it into a 2-hour film. And that's what we get here. Amidst an intergalactic war, this story is a love triangle that we follow between a pilot, a singer, and an officer. And as this conflict reaches the climax, music and love become key to humanity's survival. And there's mecha in it, there's romance, there's music. It's very influential. It was a real fun film. I had never seen this or any of these films from this series, but I had a great time watching this. And as a fan of things like Voltron, Robotech when I was a kid, this totally fit into that mecha style of animation. How does this one kind of reflect the way that we were starting to move into some of these like mecha sci-fi sorts of elements that started in anime? Was it things like Star Wars that kind of started shifting into these space operas, or where was the shift?
Giant robots have been part of anime since the 60s. But one of the first three anime, Astro Boy was the first, and there was two others in 63, and one of them was about giant robots.
Yeah. I think one of them was called Giant Robo in English.
Yeah. In the 70s, you mentioned Yamato and Star Wars, and they were actually came out within about 6 months of each other.
Oh, okay.
The Space Battleship Yamato movie, and then the Japanese release of Star Wars. So this became known, 78 became known as the year of science fiction. And that really was what touched off the emergence of anime fandom as separate from manga fandom. They were still gathering at manga taikais like Comiket or whatever, but it was becoming more and more sort of its own thing. And Macross, this is part of a TV series that becomes a franchise that's still going strong. And there's still always the element of the love triangle and the intergalactic war and the music. And if you liked this one, most of Macross is actually coming to Disney Plus sometime this year, I believe.
Oh, wow.
This
okay.
one, yes, they have announced it. But I think Do You Remember Love and SDF Macross, the TV series, I think those are excluded because the word is that the studio is still trying to shop adaptation rights to Hollywood. It's like, well, if you want people to adapt it, you should have it on Disney Plus so we can see that it's good. But yeah, and as we mentioned, anime fan cultures, people lined up around the block overnight for this movie too. So, and actually, speaking of Studio Gainax, they make a self-parody movie later on called Otaku no Video, and they parody people lining up for this movie in that movie. So it's very sort of
fantastic.
Self-referential. And again, we mentioned the theme of, ecological destruction. They do in this movie visit Earth and find that it's been completely laid to waste. So that's an element that I think rears up again. But yeah, I mean, it's been a long time since I've seen this movie, and I'd sort of forgotten how much gender plays a role. The alien race that they're fighting is like divided into male and female, and they like fight each other and don't interact. And there's a lot of sort of stuff with the male protagonist and his superior officer love interest and their colleagues and gender relations there. Some of it kind of ishy from a contemporary perspective. In some ways, comments about, gender relations in the 70s. Yeah, I didn't need that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think the space battles are great. The music is still really great. Lin Min-mei is the singer character. She's explicitly Chinese Japanese, which is interesting. And the music is really cool. I mean, also like it's very 80s. So if you were wondering what like Japanese idol pop in the 80s was like, here you go. But it works really well in the film. It's interesting too, like just, the conceit is that it's this survivorship of 50,000 people, but like they're living like a sort of normal 80s life on this ship in some ways. And then she's talking about like, oh, this is my first concert. Like I'm going to record my first album. And you're like, girl, there are 50,000 humans left. And this is what you're doing, apparently. So it's interesting.
We still need our entertainment.
Yes, it's very distantly removed, but like idol anime has become a huge thing in the past sort of 10 to 15 years. And you can see again the roots of that here, It worked pretty well the first time. So
I would second all that again, because it's a perfect encapsulation of what's going on in this movie. What you also see here is a range of different genres coming together for the first time. It's like a genre mashup, this movie. So you have the mecha elements, but and the space battles, but you also have little inklings of 80s pop, like literal idol pop culture coming through from live action. You get influence from the tokusatsu, or the special effects genre, which, you know, kind of starts out of things like the Suitmation and Godzilla. But then by the time you get to the 70s and 80s, you get these long running live action special effects shows with, you know, it's kind of where Power Rangers comes from and all of that sort of stuff as well. And that's like just edging its way into the teams in anime with some of the setups for the teams. But here what we're getting, I think more than that, is the influence of the kind of special effects sequences from some of those tokusatsu shows. So it's a proper genre mashup, and I love every second of it for that reason, because you can see them appealing to the different audiences for popular culture in Japan through this film. And you can only do that in anime. You could only push all of those things together in anime. You couldn't make this work in any other medium.
It is a lot of fun, a lot of fun. And, you know, just in the scope of animation also, just speaking to the action choreography, like it's thrilling to see some of the sequences when they're fighting in space. Like they do a solid job of creating this world and making something really exciting. And I have a penchant for spaceships that transform. Anyway, that's always a lot of fun to watch in these.
Yeah, I once wrote about the Japanese version of Spider-Man, where of course Spider-Man has his own proper transforming robot spaceship, because in Japan he would need it.
Exactly.
Because he's fighting these giant kaiju monsters. You know, this stuff is all the way through 80s and 70s culture in Japan, and I love that we're seeing it here in the transformations, which is, to be serious for a moment, is something animation does. I think metamorphosis and transformation is something animation does better than any other medium. It's why special effects often leans on animation in those moments of transformation.
Yeah.
You know, you can see them playing to the strengths of animation in those sequences in this movie.
Yeah, you mentioned the action sequences. This movie, I think, is one of the first places where people start to really specialize in that kind of animation. Later on, you'll see people credited as doing just like the weaponry design, or just the fight scene choreography, or just the mecha design. So, and that kind of thing. One part of otaku culture that emerges in this era is the VCR, and using the VCR to go frame by frame, and also to like pour over the list of credits at the end of shows and movies. And thanks to that sort of ability to watch and go back and to go frame by frame, otaku anime fans really start to follow sort of below the line or below the top credit creative professionals in a way that I think is, again, pretty unique to anime fan cultures.
Yeah.
More recently, you know, the Pretty Cure TV series had like the fight coordinator from Gundam. So a lot of Gundam fans watched it because they're like, well, I loved his fight scenes. I'll watch this show about, you know, magical girls with music fighting, whatever. So that kind of thing is enabled by this attention to detail.
Really interesting. That's fascinating. And it'll be interesting to see the evolution of this style when we get to something like Evangelion, where we're still dealing with kind of the world of mecha and giant robots and the way things kind of shift and everything. Before we get there, we've got a few more films, and the next is one of my favorite films. We're going back to Miyazaki, and we're going to chat for a few minutes about My Neighbor Totoro, two young girls who move with their father to the country to be closer to the hospital where their mother is ill. While there, aside from just exploring and being children, we really see how they befriend these forest spirits, particularly Totoro, and they embark on some adventures. They learn about family, friendship, nature, all these wonderful things. Absolutely timeless film, just one of my absolute favorites. Let's talk about Totoro for a little bit and the shift where Miyazaki was kind of going in his career at this point.
This is Miyazaki's second film for Studio Ghibli. It's made as part of a double bill with Isao Takahata's film Grave of the Fireflies.
Wow.
That's a double bill for you.
Yeah, that's a tough one to watch back to back. Eesh.
Yeah. So this is a really beautifully made film again. It's got beautiful natural imagery of a kind of forgotten Showa era 1950s past of Japan. It's got the lovely kind of nods backwards to what Japan was like in the 1950s. These kind of modern but also on the edge of modernity spaces in the film, where the girls and their father, Satsuki and Mei and their father, moved to an old house, and it's being opened up. It's in this countryside setting so they can be near to their mother, who's in hospital with tuberculosis. And so you have this kind of pastoral setting, and the Totoro become a way for the children to connect with the natural world around them and to deal with the shift in locations. But at the same time, at times it's about the opening up of the landscape and the possibilities of nature and magic to work together, which is quite interesting. There's a scene in the film where the father takes his daughters to pay homage, to go and pay respects at a local shrine. And the shrine is based around the tree in which Totoro lives. So there's a real kind of back and forth between traditional Shinto animistic representation in the film, but also the possibilities for magic beyond Shinto, because the Totoro are just invented creatures here. And it is the origin of everybody's favorite cat in animation, the cat bus. So there's a lot going on in this movie in terms of fantasy, but it is really carefully layered over a history that was real in Japan and a kind of lost nostalgic tradition for living in certain ways in Japan. Makiko Futaki, who's one of the key animators and one of the women of Ghibli, has talked about how there's a sequence in where you have little tadpoles in a pond. She talks about that having been a really fond memory of hers from childhood, when she would go outside of her house in the countryside and they would just have little pools that were there because of the rainy season. But then how, as she grew up, Japan was modernizing and everything was concreted over, and that became a lost childhood experience, and she wanted to put it back in the movie as a paean to Japanese lost natural landscapes. So there's loads of little details in it that are utterly drawn from memory, from the animators, from the reality of living in Japan, and then layered on top of that, you have these beautiful, amazing, fantastical creatures.
It's a really great movie. I hadn't seen it in a long time. I'd sort of forgotten there's only 3 Totoro. You go to the Ghibli Museum, you go anywhere in Japan, and there's endless Totoro, but there's only 3 of them.
Yeah.
There's small, medium, and large in the
right.
movie, which I had completely forgotten. It's interesting because, again, we've talked a bit about how Miyazaki doesn't like otaku culture, and Ghibli claims to be sort of more thoughtful in their merchandising, but it's well, there's a lot of Totoro going on here. Yeah.
I wanted to just that is so right. But the latest Ghibli park that they've just opened in Nagakute City is really interesting because they basically have a little hillside that you walk up to see the wood Totoro sculpture at the top, which is kind of based on what this is based on. But what they've done is actually put a stall next to that Totoro that looks like a Shinto shrine stall. And everything they sell there is kind of based on that link between religious practice and Ghibli, which is the most overt statement about that movie and its connections to Japan and animism that I've ever seen. It's fascinating.
I mean, I also think part of the trend of anime pilgrimages and shrines and temples, especially shrines, latching themselves onto anime as a way to bring in money. So that's fascinating. I haven't been to Ghibli Park yet, but I will go, and I will ride the cat bus at 1,000 yen per pop. I will only ride it one way. But I mean, this was always the complaint about the Ghibli Museum, was that only children could go on the cat bus in the Ghibli Museum.
Interesting.
Which was, horrible. So for those of us who are only young at heart.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, it's a great movie. I was also, again, I hadn't watched it in a long time. And I was like, my God, the mom has TB. That's something that went away in the 60s after Japan had national health care. Suddenly people stopped getting TB and they stopped dying of it. Yeah, it is very much sort of probably late 50s-ish, they're hauling out their massive radio, they're still doing telegrams. One thing I was thinking about when I was watching it this time was how for people who were sort of in their 30s watching the movie or older, so the parents of the children in the theater, it would have been very nostalgic for them for their childhoods. And Miyazaki too. I mean, he was a little older than that, but it very much already a lost experience by the 80s when, as you said, everything has been concreted over.
Well, to that end, I mean, there is an interesting element, and I wonder if this is part of the kind of this evolution of anime that we're talking about. I mean, some of these previous films we've talked about, I mean, you can see them being fine for kids to watch, but this one feels, I guess, in American rating system parlance, the most G-rated of the films that we've been talking about, you know? I mean, sure, she still has TB, but it feels much more appropriate, I guess I'll just say, for younger audiences. You know, some of the earlier films that we've been watching, and certainly some of the later ones, they definitely don't seem necessarily like children friendly. Is this one, is this a trend that we start seeing in anime that, I don't know, maybe it's part of what Studio Ghibli is working toward?
I mean, you get the rise of anime pornography when you get the rise of VHS. So there are genres aimed at every age group in anime. There are, of course, anime that are aimed at children as well. Doraemon is one of the longest running of those. Very much G-rated, very much kid-friendly, or usually anyway.
I think there's a higher tolerance for sort of scatological and mildly risque humor and stuff aimed at children in Japan.
Oh, Crayon Shin-chan is a
Crayon. Yeah, that's the one I was thinking of. Is Crayon Shin-chan. Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think in some ways the actual difference is in the 70s and 80s is the rise of stuff that was aimed at adults in animation.
Oh, okay.
Like Macross, like Akira, as we're going to see next, Ghost in the Shell, of course. I mean, it was still sort of socially weird to be sort of older than college age and explicitly like, I like animation, at least not amongst anime fans, but there were certainly a lot of people who fit that bill at this point, and they become a market that companies want to capture. So Miyazaki in some ways is sort of resisting that in Ghibli. I was also remembering too, like actually when I was learning Japanese in college, like we watched clips from this film, to learn like Japanese cultural practices, like the mixed bathing with the dad and the kids. And I think we also learned about like taking off your shoes and saying like tadaima, okaeri nasai, or itekimasu, you know, when you leave. So yeah, like it is really this reservoir of like Japanese tradition in some ways, idealized obviously, but still, I mean, not unreal despite that.
Yeah, no.
I mean, it's interesting you talk about this as G-rated because a few years ago there was an internet meme that went around about questioning whether or not the Totoro were death gods or Shinigami.
Oh.
Yeah.
Just watch the movie all the way to the end is the answer to that one. No, they are not. Susan Napier in her book Miyazaki World does a fabulous takedown of that idea, just looking at where it starts, but also then tracing it through the movie and saying like, these are the ways in which you know this isn't true. Like they are genuinely helpful spirits. You know, that is what they're doing here. But I do think that kind of reinterpretation over time has been so fascinating to watch, seeing how even the movies that are G-rated, that are anime, are complex in ways that invite these kinds of speculations from fans, right?
Well, and yeah, when you've seen some of these other films and you're like maybe reaching to try finding a little more in something like this, I can see that. Let's take a shift. Same year, but we're definitely going the direction that I was just talking about. It's certainly something that's a little darker here. We're talking about Akira, Katsuhiro Otomo's film. This is dystopian Neo-Tokyo. We've got this fantastic biker gang, and one of them comes into contact with these people called espers that kind of ends up giving them a telekinetic abilities. The government, this shadowy organization, everybody's kind of out to figure out, like, to catch this person because his ability starts spiraling out of control. His friend is trying to help him and save him. And of course, he is drawn ever closer to the Akira project. As I was researching this, I saw that the Akira slide, which we see on the motorcycle, actually is a thing. And it came from this. And I didn't realize that. I mean, I remember it from the film, but I didn't put two and two together that actually kind of came from this film. But I mean, talk about something that, certainly has the atomic imagery, definitely is influencing the cyberpunk genre in anime, outside of anime. It's definitely a thing that we see. And it's really a movie, themes of destruction, rebuilding, kind of just, there are so many things going on here.
Oh man, this movie is just so stupendous. I remembered it being stupendous, but again, watching it, you're just like, amazed. And it's really something too to watch something where you're like, so much came from this. There's Ghost in the Shell, there's The Matrix, there's all this other stuff around the world that really came from this movie. But I think interestingly, actually, you mentioned the Akira slide. That comes from Miyazaki.
Oh, really?
Katsuhiro Otomo actually learned storyboarding by watching repeatedly on the VCR the last two Lupin the Third episodes that Miyazaki did after he'd done Cagliostro. And he complained bitterly about this afterward. He complains bitterly about a lot of things. But so the Akira slide is actually in those episodes. I think it's Zenigata who does it, but it's reversed. So I think this is one thing to sort of keep in mind, is that Otomo had been a mangaka. He did still do manga after this to some extent, but he was adapting his own manga, Akira, at the time, which was already hugely popular. It's different than the film, both in terms of the way the plot develops, but also I think in some ways the sort of political implications are kind of interestingly opposite between the movie and the manga. But in the movie, you know, you have this postmodern sort of destroyed Tokyo, but it's also 2019 and they're preparing to host the 2020 Tokyo Olympics, which is another thing. You're like, wow. All right then. And even though it is sort of neo Tokyo and they've reclaimed all this land in Tokyo Bay, I think there's also ways in which it's very much straight up the 80s in Japan. The military officer is ranting about like decadent consumerism all the time. And you're like, and corruption of politicians. And you're like, oh yeah, it's the 80s. But yeah, Otomo had directed a short film before this, which again, he learned storyboarding from watching those Miyazaki Lupin episodes. So there's this sort of interesting sort of hidden lineage there. So you wouldn't connect Akira and Ghibli, but they do have a connection. And yeah, I mean, it's just everything comes from Akira in so many ways.
Very influential.
And it really is,
sure.
it really is just a great movie. And I think also too, one thing that I was struck again by watching this time, Kei, the female revolutionary activist who becomes this medium who channels the powers of the espers, the grotesque kindergarten, as one character calls them, which is a really great line. She actually, I think a lot of people watching would have been reminded of the Japanese Red Army and Fusako Shigenobu, its leader. A lot of their slogans are on the flags that people are waving in the activism and rioting scenes. And as much as it's Japan in the 80s, I think those scenes are straight out of the student movement in the late 1960s and early 1970s, which was quite violent in some respects. So I think, you know, again, for people who are watching, it would have been very familiar in that way, in a way that I think other audiences outside Japan wouldn't have had that context. But yeah, like watching it again, I was like, oh yeah, it's the 60s, the way they're fighting the government and rioting over tax increases and stuff. So yeah, like it has this very strong sci-fi element, but it also has this sort of local context as well, which I think you don't need to know to enjoy the film, but definitely adds other layers when you do.
This is one of the movies that makes anime fully visible internationally. It's got a proper cinematic release around the world. I think when I was tracing it, some of the earliest reviews are from Australia, then goes over to America, and it gets this really big, has this really big impact because, of course, 1980s America, most animation that is coming through cinemas is for children. You know, so straight up, it's a very different proposition to a lot of what's being seen in animation at the time. Makes anime visible in a way, I think, that is really important for anime. And you get a kind of follow-up in that with Ghost in the Shell later on. But the fact that it's sci-fi, the fact that it's cyberpunk, the fact that it's dystopian is really important to it being taken so seriously. And I think Akira really did set out Japanese animation stall for the international community of animation scholars and animation fans writ large, because it showed different ways of engaging with mature themes that weren't just about anime pornography, but were about really kind of adult political, ideological storytelling as well. So it's such an important watershed moment in that regard.
It really speaks to, I mean, what Guillermo del Toro said recently when he won his Oscar for Pinocchio, is that animation is a medium. It's not just a thing that's just for kids. Like, it's just a tool you can use to tell your story. And I think that's an interesting element in our conversation specifically about anime. While it is a term that we use to kind of blanket a lot of these types of things. I mean, we're talking about a lot of different genres here, and in some definitely are more four-quadrant films, I guess we could just say in studio parlance, and some feel much more targeted, like to the R-rated, much more intense sorts of crowds. And it's adult thinking. Like there's a lot of themes and complex elements going on in this story. It's fascinating.
For sure.
And that holds true for the next one, Ghost in the Shell, 1995. Mamoru Oshii made this film, and the story in the future, there's this cybernetic enhancements that people get. There's this very talented cyborg agent. They're investigating this hacker known as the Puppet Master as she's going through this process, confronting questions about consciousness and humanity in this world that's getting increasingly technological, also based on a manga that's definitely kind of blurring some lines between humanity and technology. It's kind of this classic cyberpunk film. On rewatch, I just was taken by how complex a lot of the philosophical questions that it's asking are. Coming from Akira, especially, like moving into this, how have things shifted here?
Akira made people be on the lookout for the next Akira. And Manga Entertainment, the US distribution company, was really pushing to try to find another big hit like that. So they actually joined the production committee for this film and got Oshii the money to do it. He had done a couple of, I think, one or two smaller films before this, but this was his sort of big break. And it did do fairly well, both in Japan and the States, enough that he, attributes the fact that he had a career afterwards to it, even though I think this is a high watermark in terms of commercial appeal and also in terms of the philosophy not sort of overwhelming everything else in the movies. So it is interesting if you watch the credits, you do see Manga Entertainment, and I think Adam Frayne was the executive producer who was credited in that. So that's like I don't know if it was truly a first, but it was certainly a milestone that Americans were involved in this. But Oshii says that he still had complete creative control, which I think some people would say like, oh, it was always for Americans, but it's very clearly not for Americans per se. It's kind of aimed at that same adult audience. I was struck this time by how short it is. Ghost in the Shell has become a franchise, and in some ways I think actually I like the standalone complex anime best, and that's sort of what I tend to think of when I think of Ghost in the Shell as opposed to the movies. But yeah, it's quite short, but like, again, quite impactful. The music is quite something. I was also struck by the ways in which, like, they don't ever explicitly say that it's Tokyo, but it's clearly Tokyo. But it's like, why is the Kowloon walled city here? Why is this like early 80s Hong Kong wet market here? In what world would Japan ever allow refugees in? Like, come on now. So in some respects, that seems to be like even more of a cyberpunk fantasy than the Major and her cyborg body that keeps getting recreated, in ways I think it's quite disturbing, actually, some of the scenes of like people getting shot and then also bodies getting disassembled and reassembled. And the way in which the Puppet Master can hack people is also, I think, pretty creepily done. And then the ending is just like, bam. I think Oshii had a very strong vision and he attained it.
And the philosophical side of this movie is entirely intentional for anybody who hasn't seen it before. There is a heavy amount of quoting of Nietzsche and Heidegger and a bunch of other European philosophers. And some really, in the second movie, Innocence, that comes along a bit later, I think it's even more obvious there that there's some hefty Christian coding going on. So there's definitely a kind of international impulse behind this movie, which picks up on that. Is it Kowloon Bay? Is it Hong Kong? Is it Tokyo? Like, where is this set?
Yeah.
It's really important that I think it's in this other place because it's intentionally asking us to think about othering the self. Like, what is the nature of the ghost in the machine? And not to be too trite about it, but Ghost in the Shell is an almost perfect movie for the current moment. Like, it is all about generative AI and the possibilities of generative AI and the limits of the self in relation to AI. But also, I think, in terms of our moment right now, as we all walk around with mobile phones and we're all kind of using technologies to interact all the time, there are questions there about where we end and others begin that are beginning to be really pertinent in a way that this movie presages entirely. It's working through philosophically and, I think, culturally through some of those ideas around technology, the self, and the possibilities for technology going forward. And again, animation is the perfect place to do this. You can deconstruct the female body down to its component parts using animation. You can have an animated character who is female in a really emphatic way, but then is also robot whose arms deconstruct at the slightest provocation, it seems to me, in this movie. There's real moments in this movie of gravitas and of humanity within this. And I think Motoko Kusanagi is one of the perfect cyborg female characters in cinema. She is both the core of this movie and its protagonist, but also a kind of questioning center to the film, because she is thinking about who she is in relation to technology all the way through. And Bato, her partner, and others are questioning who she is through the movie. And the different forms she takes in the movie become really significant to understanding the self in relation to AI, I think, in ways that are predicting and playing with questions of philosophy and technology that were pertinent at the time, but so much more so even now.
Yeah, right. Really relevant today. The pairing of these films, Akira 2, Ghost in the Shell, and then our next film that we're going to talk about, The End of Evangelion. This is the last 2 episodes essentially redone of the Neon Genesis Evangelion animated series. This is largely episodes 25 and 26 recreated because a lot of people were confused by the direction that the show ended, because it definitely felt a little more avant-garde in some ways. And so this was a different way to take the ending. I mean, I can imagine stepping into this not having seen the series, that it might be a little challenging.
A little?
Yeah, a little, yeah. But it's an interesting trend. And I mean, we can see that even with Ghost in the Shell, where they redid some of it with CG to do some new stuff and re-released it as Ghost in the Shell 2.0. I don't know how, like, I was looking at the Evangelion, it's like Evangelion 1.11, 3.3, like all of these different reversionings of the Evangelion story. But this is a really fascinating film. I actually watched this the series a while back with my son. The story, it's a cast that's, there's this apocalyptic event happening. They have these Evangelions, these Evas, these giant robots that they can pair with, essentially, and get into to fight these beings that come down that they have to battle over a period of time. I watched it with my son. It was a little over his head, a little adult for him. He's 13, but he also really connected with it. And now he's just always on Crunchyroll watching shows left and right. Like I think he's completely taken by anime. He's drawing anime. And this show really kind of clicked things into a place for him. And while it was a little adult, it was a really interesting stepping stone for him in his growing his interests. But going back to my original point about like this arbitrary pairing of these 3 films back to back to back, there is an interesting evolution that we're seeing in kind of the way technology and this future view of society looks. And this film takes a really fascinating direction, especially coming after Ghost in the Shell. We're seeing very existential themes, very psychological exploration of these characters that's quite powerful. And it's a really interesting ending. I mean, both endings are interesting, but it's certainly this one, I think, is pretty interesting. What are your thoughts on this and kind of Evangelion as a whole?
Oh boy,
is that maybe too big of a question?
Be here for hours.
Yeah.
End of Evangelion is extremely psychological, but it's actually much more action oriented and comprehensible than the original 2 final episodes of the show. For those who don't know, Gainax was literally running out of money as they were finishing Eva, the series. So in the final 2 episodes, you're seeing them animating like on 4s, just stretching the repetitive and the money-saving techniques as far as they will go to try to have enough money to get an episode that they can broadcast. And people hated it. People completely didn't know what was happening. I tend to think that it's easier to understand the TV series ending after you've seen End of Evangelion, but they were broadcast in the opposite order. So people had no idea what was going on. Anno got death threats.
Oh, jeez.
But it was also hugely popular. And so there was enough support amongst the other production committee sponsors to go back and give them more money to make the film, which I think, along with the death and rebirth edit of the TV episodes, which was shown in theaters as well, as a sort of synopsis movie of the first 24 episodes, that really cemented Eva as a phenomenon.
Well, there's a lot of religious imagery in this one that, I feel like we haven't necessarily run into as much religious imagery in any of these films. And just having talked about Ghost in the Shell, certainly we have the philosophical angle, but suddenly we're also getting thrust a lot of this religious imagery, a lot of crosses, things like that speak to some of the idea of humanity and spirituality and kind of these themes that it's exploring.
Yeah, even Neon Genesis Evangelion is Greek new gospel of the rebirth or whatever. And it's not just Christian themes. There's also Kabbalah, the Eva series, and Unit 01 make the Kabbalah diagram in the sky at one point in this film, which I think is sort of Anno's kind of privilege as a Japanese person who is not native to these things. He can sort of pick and choose and include the stuff that he thinks seems cool and relevant without much regard to how it holds together in its original context. And at the end, we have Adam and Eve and Lilith again. But Lilith and Eve are kind of switched. I was struck again watching it this time. Yui is like, oh, don't worry. Everything that has a will recohere out of the primordial goo. And you're like, I don't know, Yui. I'm not seeing it. At the end, the movie got a lot of flack in some quarters for being very pessimistic. But to me, I don't think it really seems pessimistic until the final line when Asuka is disgusting. And then it ends. And you're like, oh, crap.
Yeah.
If you haven't seen the rebuild movies, I think I would recommend them. Anno went back and sort of redid the story with money all the way through, which did not have the first time. I think the fourth film in that is the third and fourth films in particular are very different from the show and the first two movies. I think in some ways it's more conventional, but also more satisfying. It explains the characters at much greater depth in some ways. And it's an interesting way to regard the story. But I don't think it will ever have the same impact as the original and this movie did.
I would agree with that. I think what you lose in the kind of CGI inflected movies that Anna's been doing over the last few years is a lot of the humor that was in the original TV show, which was really fun to watch. It made it really fun to watch. Yeah, the penguin has a much reduced role, I think, as we get the remakes. I think there's also some really interesting things going on. You're right, it's almost Oedipal. There's a family complex Greek tragedy in here. But at its heart, this is a teen show. This is properly aimed at teenagers. And this show and its success and its fandom that has lasted for so long, I think, are why we still have shows like Attack on Titan now. That's the same impulse that drives Eva is driving the fandom around Attack on Titan. There's a vicious nihilism in it at times, with the unmaking of people and unmaking of humanity, but also with a real sense of teenagers feeling stuck in a particular moment in time. And I think that goes back to 1990s Japan, the end of the bubble economy. You've had the Aum Shinrikyo attack quite recently on the Tokyo's underground, which has sent shockwaves through Japanese culture. But just the kind of rising youth unrest as well, again in the 1990s, which is finding an outlet through popular culture and things like Evangelion. And it's interesting because it's animators like Anno who are coming out of the fandom into animation as an industry who seem to be driving a lot of that in Japanese animation. And again, TV animation is then becoming film animation, and film animation has got this interesting relationship narratively back to the story, where film is making things more grandiose, technically, often aesthetically more beauteous, more movement, but there is that shift in genres at the same time that goes from the kind of moving genre map of the TV show into something much more kind of serious for the film here in Evangelion that's really interesting. And that's what seems to be retained is the tone of the movies going, although different as they go into the rebuild series.
Yeah, I mean, it is a giant robot show, but like the giant robots are really freaking creepy. Like they're extremely organic, they bleed. And the strict battery limit, which plays a role in the final episode in this movie, that psychological aspect does, I think, influence a lot of later anime. And I mean, and the stuff about gender too. There's many, many later robot anime which take that on in various ways, some of which are downright regressive. Yeah, that youth unrest and the sense of things, that nihilism, I think economic conditions in Japan haven't really changed meaningfully very much. Real incomes have been flat for 30 years. So I think that's part of what has sort of fueled the same, like the repeat of those motifs in pop culture is the fact that things are still not great in a lot of ways. But yeah, there's a humor to many elements of the TV series, which I think is not in the movies and is not in the rebuilds, unfortunately.
But it's a fascinating story, and you're right. It's like there is this element of, we're following teenagers who are being recruited to pilot these EVAs, and watching Shinji grow up to be this warrior, but also just trying to figure out himself as this isolated teenager. I mean, it's really kind of, it's quite powerful in his depiction.
I mean, does he grow up?
Well, yeah, right. He always is having these issues with his father.
Yeah.
And just kind of like that. He's kind of so stuck in some of those elements.
You can't not mention Gendo, the archetypal anime bad dad. I was watching the Pluto anime on Netflix recently, and like they gave Dr. Tenma, who's maybe the original anime bad dad, they gave him the Gendo glasses shot just in case you hadn't gotten that he's a bad dad, know.
Right.
So in that respect, it's hugely influential, I think, as well. The turn towards sort of alternate universes and parallel universes, I think, is prefigured here, not directly in the show, but I think it's episode 24 where there's like the school AU. Mm-hmm. That became a sort of own spin-off thing that was merchandised, and AUs, I think, from this point on become sort of increasingly like official and merchandised throughout the media mix. So, and like Eva went places with merchandising that had not been gone before, like canned bread. And it lives on in pachinko machines too. So and you still see people like just doing spontaneous Eva memes on Twitter. Even now, people just quoting the show and getting a huge response because it's still so current.
Still massively popular as cosplay, still.
Oh, yeah.
And still there are, like last time I was in Japan, there are still shops in Tokyo selling exclusively EVA.
Oh, wow. That popular. That's amazing.
Yeah. And I mean, Rei and Asuka, especially Rei, were also like, became huge character archetypes as well. I think Asuka's kind of the original tsundere in some ways, But yeah, like, just can't be overstated the impact it had on later anime.
Yeah.
Definitely with these teen characters, it's fascinating, and kind of the way that it taps into pop culture. The next film we're going to talk about, Satoshi Kon's Paprika. Satoshi Kon certainly is tapped into pop culture. I mean, Perfect Blue has the pop star and everything. This film, though, it's tapping into kind of this whole idea of technologies, and we're kind of going back to technology and everything. And here we have, we were mentioning as we were prepping for this, kind of the ideas that Christopher Nolan pulled from this, as far as like being able to go into people's dreams. Like the idea is that there's this device where therapists can enter patients' dreams to kind of help them as they're counseling. However, it gets stolen. And so this brilliant therapist has to navigate, as the film progresses, increasingly blurring lines between reality and the dream world to figure out who the culprit is and to capture that person. And over the course of it, her character becomes Paprika, this character, as she goes into these dream states. And what a fascinating film. I love all four of Satoshi Kon's films. This one is just beautiful in its depiction of the dream world and how everything is kind of exploring. But we're going back to this idea of a lot of these psychological themes. We're pushing the boundaries, certainly, of anime storytelling here as the dreams kind of explode into the real world. But I think that it's important at this point to kind of talk about like how we're starting to see, especially over the next few films that we're going to be talking about, we're seeing a shift in the filmmakers and the style of films and what anime is doing. How does this one play for the two of you?
Would you believe it only cost $2.5 million?
Crazy.
Wow.
Or less.
There's a lot of things moving on the screen in those dreams. Yeah.
Yeah. Khan was not necessarily well liked in the industry. He had a reputation for being very sort of acid tongued. So his movies never really got kind of the success that I think most people would agree they deserved, at least in Japan. You know, he made Perfect Blue, and then he got the funding to make Tokyo Godfathers because like one super fan of Perfect Blue was a producer. So he was always operating on these shoestring budgets, and he developed the technique of doing extremely detailed storyboards, like the most detailed storyboards probably ever. Because then he would do all the storyboards, and then they could just, you know, he would do layout, he'd do design, he'd do many other aspects of the film in the storyboards. So you could go from that to the animation very easily. And also, I think in all of his films, but especially Perfect Blue and this one, again, like there's just reusing shots over and over in ways that work. You know, in Perfect Blue, it illustrates the sort of psychological breakdown between reality and her mental distress. But here, it's, you know, reality versus dreams, which are also movies. They say explicitly very early on in the movie that like dreams are movies, which I think for me was one of the pleasures of sort of going back and watching this film. Paprika at one point tries to say that dreams are like the internet. And it's like, no, dreams are not like the internet, especially not like the internet as it is now. And not really like the internet as it was then either. But dreams are like movies, and the figure of the cop, who I'd completely forgotten about, and the way the movie ends with him going to see a movie again after having experienced a psychological rapprochement with his past.
That is a Satoshi Kon trope right from the get-go, right from Perfect Blue. He's making films that are about the permeability of screens, about windows as reflections, about TV shows, about reflecting, like people acting in TV shows, having that impact on their mental health, but their everyday lives, to Millennium Actress, where he's literally got an actress going back through memory of making films to her own memories, you know, and there's a permeability between memory and film there again, you know, so here he's kind of refined that idea one more time for the sake of science fiction. And in doing so, invokes some really interesting things. So in this movie, you get a hyakkiyagyo, which is a night parade of demons, but done in a dream form where it's toys instead of demons. There's fascinating ways where he's taking traditional Japanese arts and culture and repurposing them at the same time as he's making permeable screens that people are passing through and in and out of. The credit sequence for this movie alone is well worth a proper thinking about, because in it you get this lovely sequence in which sometimes Paprika is really Paprika, sometimes she's a projection of Paprika that people can see or not see. So it's this wonderful back and forth and playful approach to the audience and our expectations of the character and what she should and should not be able to do. And again, you can't do this outside of animation as well as it works in animation. Kon was somebody, for all that he might be not popular in the anime industry, I think you're absolutely right, Andrea. He was very much known for rubbing people up the wrong way, should we say. But he was also really good at what animation does that no other medium can do as well. You know, so he's playing with the animation form here in a way that's really interesting. I think the other thing he does, again, throughout his set of films that he made, was playing with questions of performed selfhood versus interior selfhood. And that, you're right, that moment with Konakawa, the detective at the end, where he's made peace with his past and he comes out and walks past movie posters for Satoshi Kon's other movies.
Yes. Yes.
Moment. It's like, and I've made the peace with my own past. And there's a poster in there in the mix, which I think isn't one of his, and I think was supposed to be his next movie. So there's even a presaging of what he was thinking about doing next in the film. So it's a wonderful kind of encapsulation of him as a director is Paprika, I think.
Yeah.
It's also got some of the most disturbing scenes I've ever seen in animation. The idea of the body being something you can unzip or mutilate is there's some really graphic psychologically horrible scenes in this movie that are really powerful because they are about gender and they are about vulnerability when we're dreaming. And that is really some of the most disturbing scenes I've seen in anime for a long time are in this movie, but they're also rendered in a way that is a purposeful use of those tropes in the storytelling, which is also really interesting because often when we see those kind of more graphic sequences, they're not connected to storytelling. And here they absolutely are key to what the story is trying to put across for us.
Yeah. The next film we have on our list, Summer Wars 2009, made by Mamoru Hosoda. This film, I hadn't seen it before, a little tricky to track down, but it's a fascinating film, and I wasn't sure where it was going to go because we start with this high school student who has to, it's one of these movies where he has to, pose as a boyfriend for this girl who's going back to her family's house on a trip. But in the process of all of the what seems kind of like rom-com antics in the process of this, there's this powerful AI that this high school student accidentally unleashes on the world with this online platform, and it starts wreaking havoc. And then he and this girl and her family end up working together to stop it. And it never was going in a direction I expected. And I had such a great time with this film. I mean, it was such a surprise, and I absolutely loved it. So again, moving into the way that technology is ever shifting, and we see that consistently over all of these. We're really getting into the idea of these virtual worlds, these online platforms that people can enter, and the dangers of them. I mean, it really is. It does feel like the next step in the evolution of what we're watching here.
Welcome to the isekai, or the other world. Yes.
Yeah.
It is really interesting the way that Hosoda sort of envisions what we would now call the metaverse, maybe, but like the metaverse is not like this. Second Life was not like that.
No.
In animation, it can be way more than it is in the real world. Maybe in some ways, people who are trying to make the metaverse a thing, like this is what they want it to be, but it's not there yet, and it's not clear that it ever will be, at least in our lifetimes. But yeah, I mean, I love this movie. I think it's probably my favorite Hosoda, but just the way the protagonist goes back to Nagano, to this like ancient family, and there's this running joke where they're always talking about how they fought the Tokugawa and lost, and every time like they have more soldiers in the story, and the ways in which like you see sort of old and new Japan, and also like the genders within the family sort of come together at the end to beat the AI using this traditional Japanese card game, which the girl who is the scion of the family, who brings the guy along to pretend to be her boyfriend for her great grandmother who's turning 90, she's the one who plays the card game against the AI and wins. So I do think, I was watching it and I was like, oh, they couldn't have made this after 3/11 because, at the end there's a meteor strike, but it's okay. It just makes an onsen spring next to their house, or not a meteor, a satellite. And the ways in which like public services are shown to work and to help people, I think, which were exposed as being that's entirely fictional during that disaster and subsequent disasters like the recent Noto earthquake. So it does have this kind of exuberance of the time, even though like, in some ways, it's very old now. Like the cousin who went to America has a smartphone and everybody else is still using flip phones because iPhones were still like brand new in Japan at the time. So it is sort of its moment in ways that I didn't notice at the time when I first watched it.
I mean, I watched this movie in Japan when it first came out. I remember sitting in a cinema and it was amazing. And, the lights went down. The first thing it does is welcome to Oz. And I was like, I'm sold. This is great. But the way it plays with the idea of computer technology is fascinating. So the irony that runs through this movie is really great as well. So the evil AI is called Love Machine. Like it's a very interesting moment in Japanese history. It's the first time, I think, since the Second World War finished that you get a party other than the main Japanese political party in charge. And it's for all of a couple of years, but this is in that moment of flux. So the movie has a kind of soft nationalism to it, a kind of let's work together, let's pull together as a nation and a people. And I think that's what Andrea very much is picking up on, the Shinohara family and the Jinoichi family are like really important as a network that is, it's such an old family that it's a network that once the grandma starts reaching out, connects across Japan to every part of the Japanese islands. You know, it's this wonderful bringing together of a real local network of family, friends and connections, which is very traditional Japan, I think, in the face of a ominously carnivorous AI that is kind of sucking up and eating up the whole of the online world that is presented in Oz. So there's this really interesting thing happening there. I also love that it's mental arithmetic and the Kenji Koiso, the main protagonist's ability to do maths in his head is kind of
Very smart kid, yeah.
Nosebleed, you know, that allows him to go up against a generative AI again that is supposed to be almost omnipotent. It's a really interesting thing. I love, again, the balance between tradition and futuristic technologies here. The use of Hanafuda is fantastic. And again, if you want to think about Japanese video games, there's a history of video games in this movie. So Hanafuda was the card game that Nintendo was famous for making before Nintendo made video games.
Oh.
And so there's links, there's little nods to people who know their computer culture in this movie all the way through. But I love that it's such a bamboozling game that the AI can't keep up with the girl that's used to playing it.
Yeah.
So Natsuki does this great performance of the oddity and the rule breaking ruliness of Hanafuda card play, which is just wonderful. And I've got to say, for me, there's some beautiful moments of computer animation in this movie. The uses of colored outlines that aren't just a typical black outline in the Oz space are absolutely gorgeous. And we see that again in Belle, I think.
Sure. Yeah. Right.
Because we were talking about that before we came on and Belle is interesting for the way it kind of amps up some of the beautiful aesthetics created for Oz in Summer Wars. But I love the way this movie plays with the idea of traditional animation is the real. Oz is the fantastical other world that is online only. And so using those two really clear, distinctive styles for these two worlds within the movie works really nicely for me. I think it's beautifully made film in that regard.
It's a really smart way to blend the different animation styles. And, you know, animation has been evolving, certainly, and we definitely see that in anime. Just connecting to the point of the satellite and the kind of the destruction there, just as we head into the last film in our discussion, Your Name, Makoto Shinkai's film, this is another film that, we're in this kind of magical realism sort of space. We've got a girl who lives in the country and a Tokyo boy. They end up swapping bodies when they fall asleep. And then they're trying to navigate in each other's lives. They end up forming this connection as they figure out what's going on, even though they've never met. And then, of course, we get this shocking realization that happens. And that's the thing that, you know, as we find out what actually happened to her as he goes to meet her potentially and finds where this asteroid had hit and kind of wiped out her entire community. And it's a fascinating film. Again, over all of the themes of everything we've been talking about, we're coming back to nature. We're coming back to a sense of these different worlds that we're portraying, the country, the city, and, devastation as people are learning to deal with something like this.
I mean, it's a great movie. I love it. I saw it in the theater. I was living in Japan at the time, weeping like a child at the ending. It is very explicitly actually about 311. And that's tied, it comes in the period of the comet that features, it's 1200 years, which is the length of time between earthquakes, between major earthquakes on the fault that caused the great Tohoku earthquake in 2011. And I think arguably, too, you can say the female protagonist is the scion of this shrine family that's been keeping the shrine and doing these rituals for all this time. But the grandmother says, you know, we don't actually know the meaning of these anymore because there was a fire 200 years ago. And you can connect that, I think, too, to some of the sort of local knowledge that was ignored or lost about, you know, the tsunami in 867. There were marker stones that showed that the waves went as high as they did, but people didn't believe them. So, yeah, it is about sort of coming to terms with disaster and moving forward ahead of that. And I made a kind of flippant remark that I think like Shinkai's three movies, like this one, Tenki no Ko and Suzume, are like denial, bargaining, and acceptance. And I'm not sure whether this one is denial or bargaining, because at the end, through this strong sort of otherworldly connection that they forge, they are able to save the day and rewrite the past and save the village, the people, not the physical village, the people
Yeah,
will wind up
right,
moving
right.
to Tokyo. But obviously that's not how it is in real life.
Yeah,
but I think
right.
that's part of the beauty of this movie, like the idea that love could save everybody. And that, these two characters, they do manage to work it out, and they do manage to, they have to get through to the girl's estranged father, who's the mayor. He was adopted into her family and then left when her mother died. So there's sort of all this kind of backstory, but it does work. And I think that's part of why it was so popular. It had this story that people wanted to be true. And plus the music, like Rad Wimps, they did great. So, and they've continued to work with Oshii. They're in Suzume too. So, not Oshii, Shinkai.
This is a movie that the more you dig into it, particularly in Japanese, the more it keeps giving you back. There's an idea of musubi, tying, in the movie that runs like a thread, like literally, which means tying, but it runs as a thread through the whole film, from the kumihimo weaving that is being done by the women of the shrine, right through to the red, you get the kind of red thread of destiny that ties Taki and Miki together through the movie. And you get this kind of play with words all the way through the film, which is about layers and tying and connection that is very deliberately worked through the story. So even I think the town is called something like Itomori or Thread Town.
Yeah. Ito no Mori.
Ito no Mori. Yeah, it's very, so the whole film is playing with this idea of connection and tying, which is, it's really interesting the more you start thinking about those ties, the ties that bind, and what's going on between these characters and how they interact with one another, even though it's very kind of the lake house with like not being in the same place at the same time.
Right.
So there's things here that are utterly generic, like the body swap comedy, like the kind of generic makeup of the movie. But then what I think Makoto Shinkai does that's so interesting is he works through themes of his own that actively do make it all tie together. Sorry to coin a phrase, but make it tie together really neatly. And I agree with you. I think it's almost like he's going in the wrong order, because this is very much a bargaining. This is like, we can remake the past here if only we get our time travel correct.
Well, the thing about grief is that like actually the stages can happen in any order.
Yeah,
so.
Exactly. But I think you're right. The theme of doorways that's in the next one, which I've just forgotten the name of.
Suzume's doorways.
Yeah, as the doorways, that is very much about acceptance, I think.
And it depicts 311 directly.
Yeah.
Which this one and Tenki no Ko do not.
Yeah, no. So Tenki no Ko is really interesting because that's much more environmentalist. And that one seems to be way more about denial. That one's like, we just refuse to engage with this.
I actually really dislike Tenki no Ko because of the way the message shakes out. I think you can easily read it as like climate denialism, and I actually almost walked out during the credits, which is like a huge thing to do. I was in Japan again, and like in Japan, you sit through the end of the credits, and I was like, no, I'm out.
Wow.
I'm going to show. I'm like, of course, everybody there thought I was just a clueless foreigner, but I was like, I know what I'm doing. I know that I'm walking out in disgust.
That's funny, and that's Weathering with You as it was released over here in the States that you're talking about. Yeah.
But again, in Weathering with You, what you do get is this repeated use of Shinto shrines as other spaces where magic is possible and things can happen that are out of the ordinary and out. So you could tie that right back to Totoro again. There are these connections to Japanese Shinto, which is an animistic tradition, that are about attempting, at least on one level or another, to engage with Japan's history, its traditions, and maybe a nostalgia for a past that no longer exists as well. My favorite parts of this movie, though, are the uses of language and the way in Your Name that they're writing messages to each other on their hands and using their mobile phones to send messages to each other. I think there's some really lovely kind of interactive play there that isn't about computers, even though the whole thing is made on computers. It's not done that way. It's made to very playfully think about different ways of representing their relationship, whether it's physical writing or computer or like phone writing or reaching across, vortices and time to connect with one another. And I can see why this has been such a popular movie, but I think as well as the music being great, the other thing that was really important for this movie and has become increasingly important to Japanese anime over the last 10, 15 years is its almost touristic perfection and vision of Japan itself. This movie was literally sponsored by some of the tourist organizations in Japan
Oh, really?
to show off the local settings as beautiful places that you might want to go and visit.
You can search Kimi no Nawa steps on Google Maps, and it'll show you the exact steps they're on at the end of the movie. The realism of locations and bringing local boosting organizations into anime production has been a huge thing. And that has in turn, as we mentioned before, boosted the promotion of like anime characters at shrines and temples. You can get like anime character goods at certain places that are related to certain shows because the shrines and temples also need money to survive. That's certainly become a thing that's been huge in anime. And I mean, given that Japan itself is increasingly oriented towards tourism as an economic growth area, I don't see that ending for at any time soon.
No, in fact, it's expanding into AR and so augmented reality stuff. So you can use your mobile phone, geolocate yourself at a particular place and have the anime character that appeared in your favorite show behind you in the location where it was made, and take pictures of yourself with them.
That's
this stuff is becoming increasingly popular.
Yeah.
And I think this is something that obviously Makoto Shinkai used to get funding for Your Name, but it's also, I think, a sign of the times very much. So there might be more like other worlds or isekai coming up in anime, and that might have become a genre in its own right. But at the same time, very specific references to real places are becoming important too. And it used to be in manga that you'd have like a book with photos and then you could copy the photos into the backgrounds of your manga. Now it feels like we're almost doing that in anime as well.
Yeah. I watched Belle and I was like, I think this is Shikoku. And then I was like, it is Shikoku. I was right, Or like, Tenki no Ko, he lives in the like tropical islands of Tokyo, which are like not well known. And Suzume, she starts in Miyazaki and then she goes to Shikoku and then Kobe and then Tokyo and then up to Tohoku area. Again, these very specific locations.
That's interesting. Yeah. Something else that I think, I can't remember who mentioned it when in our online chats as we were gearing up for this, that Shinkai also represents kind of a step in anime where it shows that he as a director is kind of influenced by a lot of the stuff that's coming out of Hollywood and kind of like that sort of shift. Like we're seeing this story, perhaps one of the reasons that it also kind of was a big success internationally is because of some of those elements that he's incorporating into the way that he tells his stories.
Yeah, I think if you look at the reception of some of his other movies, like Hoshio o Kodomo, Children Who Chase Lost Voices, from Deep Below is how it was translated, or Place Promised in Our Early Days. I like both of them a lot. I particularly like Hoshio o Kodomo, again, weeping in the theater. But yeah, those ones I think are sort of more particular and didn't travel as well. I think he's really, in the last couple of films, sort of unlocked the ways in which to present Japan in a way that, like, again, is very local and local centric, but like makes it relatable, to watchers around the world.
And that's causing a ripple effect of interest in him and his way of telling stories. I literally last summer went to a theater adaptation of In the Garden of Words, which was done in London.
Interesting.
So there are these kind of offshoots now where it's not just Studio Ghibli that's getting theatrical adaptations. Like, they're starting to come out for other makers, but Shinkai is one of them. I think that point about internationalization in anime has always been there, though. From the blue-haired girls and, green-haired girls right through to alien characters to the kind of ambiguous European otherworlds of Hayao Miyazaki's films there has always been a kind of tangential, at least, relevance of the international. It just manifests in different ways in different kinds of movies. But with Shinkai, I think you're right. In Your Name, he was very openly borrowing from Hollywood rom-coms and also body swap comedies. So there's that really interesting genre history there where he's not necessarily playing up to what we would think of as the normal genres of anime, but he does so in a way that he thoroughly localizes those ideas into an anime style aesthetic and set of themes that he's running through at least the last 4 movies he's made.
I'm so history pilled. When I first heard about the movie, I was like, oh, is he remaking the super hit radio drama of the same name from the 50s?
Oh.
No.
That would be interesting, though. That would be interesting.
Yeah.
Well, as we wrap up our conversation, I mean, it's clear from exploring kind of this evolution of anime over the decades that there's been a variety of genres used within anime in itself. But as closing this up, how has its influence on other genres in cinema and other mediums really kind of contributed to this place in, I'm always talking about this family tree of cinema and all of these different genres as these different offshoots and everything. But how has kind of all of it, the influence that we've been talking about, how has it contributed to where it fits into this big family tree?
One of the things you've picked up on repeatedly as we've been talking about these movies are intersections between anime's interpretations of genres from around the world, be it sci-fi, be it romance and comedy, like the localized versions of that and how they work then internationally to inspire other filmmakers and other genres is really important. There's definitely a feedback loop here between anime genres and other forms of genre. But I think there's kind of 2 things I would raise there as really important. Because anime has been outsourcing to Asia for such a long time now, you're starting to see anime style being done by companies across Asia. I mean, is it Studio Mir, Andrea, that's doing all the great Voltron remakes and stuff for DreamWorks?
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah. So you're starting to see that anime-inflected style appearing even in American remakes. And it's usually via companies that have done a lot of outsourcing work in the past or who have come up through that kind of outsourcing work. So anime style, very much like manga style being adapted locally around the world, is starting to become more of a thing now, I think, than it has been in the past. And the second thing I would just say in terms of genre, anime, I think, is wonderfully indiscreet. So a lot of the kind of genre shifts we're seeing at the moment are because anime is interacting with other mediums, in particular video games. So there's been a lot of interplay between video games and anime of late. I'll be really interested to see when that starts to kind of get picked up on and used in other places. I think, very much like we're seeing at the moment, a whole raft of podcast-inspired TV show hits. We may start seeing some of these kinds of adaptations, but there are still real efforts being made to get live-action adaptations of anime and manga hits to be successful around the world, many of which are missing the mark. I look at you, Death Note, but some of them, like One Piece, are starting to break through a little bit and get a bit more love from fans. So I'd be interested to see over the next 10 years or so if that ever succeeds in a regular way as a kind of accepted form of adaptation into live action. I'm not sure it will. I think what we get in anime or manga to anime to live action in Japan is much more of the kind of really successful ones are ones that don't fit into those mainstream genres. They aren't based on the big hits. So something like Sakuran, the beautiful film that was made by Mika Ninagawa a few years ago, is based on a manga by Moyoko Anno, who was married to Hideaki Anno. Fabulous manga, fabulous, beautifully designed kind of answer to Memoirs of a Geisha, made into this brilliant kind of pop art almost version of a live action movie. It takes someone like that to come along and interpret the manga into their own vision and have a kind of vision that works alongside it for me to get it to really, really speak to audiences. But we shall see. It's an interesting
right.
future, perhaps.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the video games point is very important. Shinkai actually, I think, started in video games before
Yeah.
he made anime. Yeah, so he's sort of an early figure in that. And of course, video games were influenced by manga very early on in their development at Nintendo. So there's again this kind of mutual influencing. I think the thing I would point out about this sort of adaptation drive in Hollywood and also the live action and then also the anime adaptation of other titles is that these are sort of part of the overproduction crisis in anime, especially TV anime. There's a lot of shows. People want more and more shows. International buyers want more and more shows, to feed the streaming maw. And people in the industry are getting extremely burned out. Jujutsu Kaisen, for example, the second season has been notorious for the animators going on Twitter and basically saying, like, I want to die. This is unlivable. And that's sort of at the extreme end, but it's definitely becoming more and more of a thing. So one of the reasons that, Hollywood studios are looking to studios outside Japan for their adaptations is, again, because of the overproduction crisis. So that also, too, is sort of driving the adaptation of anime aesthetics in a very sort of negative way, kind of. It's positive for the people in Studio Mir, but yeah. So I think the overproduction crisis is real and hasn't really been dealt with.
That's all across Hollywood.
Yeah, it's been talked about, but it anime is in the fortunate position of having a lot of people want it now, but they want it too fast, and so that's making real problems for people in the industry, which is no longer unionized to a great extent. That was sort of the result of these 60s labor battles, was that there are very few full-time employees and most animators are freelancers. That, I think, is something that will eventually come to a head and something will have to change. But how and why, has yet to be found out. But yeah, I think in the meantime, anime continues to be extremely popular. Studios around the world continue to want a piece of it in various forms. And I think that's only going to continue. Because it does have this, I think, unique power in a way that, we've talked here about the blending of genres and the blending of techniques. For whatever reason in Japanese animation in the industry, people are way more open to that as opposed to, like, I think in places like Hollywood, I think there's sort of much more like received wisdom about what does and doesn't work until it gets to a creative rut, which I think is kind of where we are now with places like Pixar, for example. And eventually, I think if they can survive, they'll break out of it, just like Disney did, in the end of the 80s and then entered the new golden age. But
it's all ebbs and flows, right?
Yeah. But anime, I think, has managed to, again, and partly that's just because they keep producing so much stuff.
One of the reasons why anime has such a freer version of genre mixing, it goes to Andrea's point about it coming from manga and the fact that genres are defined by audience and age groups, rather like so shoujo and shonen, so boys and girls, rather than by a particular set of content identifiers. So there is a lot more scope to play in when you think about just what is going to be popular with boys this year, or what's going to be popular with girls. And you can really mix and match and play with genres in those kinds of circumstances.
Yeah, and the great variety of manga for adults in the seinen genre, which means young men, but is basically for everybody who isn't an adult woman. There's an incalculable variety in that genre, driven partly by manga fandom. And so, there's this wealth of like weird, kooky ideas that people can keep adapting from. And, it's been shown to work as a manga and, they can make it work as an anime. So anime does have this reservoir to draw on in the form of manga and the form of other media in Japan, webtoons, for example, as places to go for content to adapt, which I think has helped keep it fresh for sure.
And if those streamers are so desperate for content, as we've noted today, it's quite hard to get hold of some of these texts.
I know.
They could make it easier for fans by licensing these movies.
Summer Wars was not on streaming. Macross, Hakujaren, only the bad version, there's more they could get. Like, go get it.
Yeah, right,
absolutely.
Right. Yeah. Well, Andrea, Rayna, it has been such a delightful conversation with the two of you, exploring anime, walking through the evolution and the changes of it, and really thinking about it as a genre or a type of arm in the cinematic family tree that fits a lot of genres within. Thank you so much for being here and being part of this conversation. Before we take off, do you have either of you have anything you want to plug? Andrea, do you have any place that you want people to go look at what you're up to?
People can check out my website. I just started a newsletter. I will be doing more stuff as hopefully the book comes out next year. So yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. And we'll make sure links are in the show notes for everybody so you can check there. Rayna, how about you?
I don't think I said earlier, but I'm a professor here at the University of Bristol in the UK. If people want to get in touch, I'm pretty easy to find. My email's on the website. And just to say again, thank you, Andy, for having us on. It's so great to have anime featured on your podcast. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
It's been a thrill. I really appreciate it. Before we close, I want to remind you that this special episode was designed for all of our listeners to enjoy, regardless of their membership status. Normally, our members get access to exclusive bonus content exploring more films, early episode releases, and an ad-free listening experience. If you enjoyed this episode and want to support the show while getting access to these perks, I encourage you to visit truestory.fm/join to explore our membership options. Your support helps us continue creating content that dives deep into the films and movements we're passionate about sharing with you. Next month, we'll venture into the raw, unfiltered world of mumblecore. We'll explore how this low-budget, high-intimacy movement stripped away the artifice of traditional filmmaking to reveal the unvarnished truths of everyday life. From naturalistic performances to improvised dialogue, we'll discover how mumblecore's DIY aesthetics and honest portrayals of human relationships breathed new life into independent cinema. Join us as we navigate the profound emotional depths of this fiercely authentic movement. Thanks for joining us on CinemaScope, part of the True Story FM Entertainment Podcast Network. Music by Orcus and Macaroon. Find us and the entire Next Reel family of film podcasts at truestory.fm. Follow us on social media at The Next Reel, and please rate and review us if your podcast app allows. As we part ways, remember, your cinematic journey never ends. Stay curious.
Andy, according to my friend Internet, this is what Letterboxd is. Letterboxd is a global social network for grassroots film discussion and discovery. Use it as a diary to record and share your opinion about films as you watch them, or just keep track of films you've seen in the past. Showcase your favorites on your profile page.
That is a lot.
You bet it is. That's why I want you to tell our fair listeners just one thing you do with Letterboxd that has changed the way you watch movies. Let them have it.
Okay, are you ready for this?
So ready.
I love lists. As of today, I have 246 lists in my account. I use them to track the movies I watch, organize them in all sorts of different ways. I track them by hand. I clone lists from other people. I use them to plan what I'm going to be watching, all sorts of things. I love creating lists. It's a fantastic tool.
Sexiest animated characters. Andy, what is this?
We love Letterboxd, and if you're a movie lover, we are sure you will too. And when you upgrade from the free account, you will remove ads and support the great Kiwi team building this amazing service.
Just use the discount code NEXTREEL or visit thenextreel.com/letterboxd to get 20% off your pro or patron membership. And it works for renewals as well.